What's your encounter with a serial killer or serious offender? Traveling out of state for a vacation with my kids. At a gas station, this man starts trying to talk to my young daughter. I immediately got between them, but not before my daughter blurted out exactly where we were going and how long we would be there. I suddenly felt sick. Something about the guy scared me. I just knew there was going to be a problem. I hustled the kids back to the car and waited to drive away out of fear he might follow us. I didn't see him come out, so I eventually drove off, but I was paranoid about it afterward. 2 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone banging aggressively on our door. He was screaming that he was with security for the complex and that there was an intruder seen in the area, so I was required by law to open the door. Obviously, I didn't fall for that. He started swearing and threatening me. Suddenly, he just stopped. Suddenly, something spooked him and he turned and bolted. He had been standing kind of off to the side and reaching over to bang on the door in a way I couldn't see his face. When he moved, I saw it. It was the guy from the gas station. He followed us through 2 states. The actual security for the complex drove around, but never found him. There was a broken gate next to the condo that they said he got in through. Some background. My stepfather was a truck driver, so often we would visit him at a local truck stop when he was near to grab breakfast, etc. My mother is not great. During one of these adventures, my mom decided she wanted us to stay with stepdad in the truck. Sister was 11, I was 9. During this 2-week period, LOL, we were in a random truck stop in Georgia. My sister and I went to take a shower because we hadn't for days and shared a shower to save on money. I was in and out and waited in the hallway for my sister. A man came up to me and started asking questions. This happened in the early 2000s, so I had been taught stranger danger, but also was still being taught always be respectful to adults BS. I was giving him basic answers, but then he pushed, showing me his truck. My tiny self was terrified, but I kept saying no, I can't. Eventually, he got annoyed and just grabbed my arm and started pulling. In that moment, my sister came out and snatched my butt back and we ran, crying, telling my mom, I'm called overdramatic. If my sister didn't see me, I'm positive I would have never been seen again. Worked a retail job that sold iPhones at a high-end mall. Guy comes in carrying a Nordstrom bag, wearing Gucci sunglasses, and asks to buy an iPhone. While I waited for our back-of-house team to bring the iPhone, I'm making casual conversation with the guy. I ask what he does for work, says he's an actor. I ask if he's been in anything I might have seen. He says The Hunger Games. I say, cool, who did you play? He mumbles something about being one of the tributes. Conversation somehow leads to him asking if I'm single. I told him I was engaged, and he was visibly annoyed. His attitude was very arrogant, and he did a lot of uncomfortable/creepy staring that I noticed after he took off his sunglasses. I had initially asked him if he was eligible for an upgrade on his phone. He was confident that he was. Well, after checking his identification, standard protocol, and pulling up the account, nope, not eligible. But his brother's phone was eligible. He insists that he can use his brother's upgrade, but I tell him that stuff like this needs to be approved by the main account holder/authorized users. So he calls his stepmom and asks to use the stepbrother's upgrade. His stepmom says no, and the guy throws a complete tantrum, saying that his brother is too young for an iPhone anyway, that he's fine using an older model, that he needs a new phone. Stepmom doesn't budge. Yet I'm stuck there for at least 20 minutes while this guy yells at his stepmom, trying desperately to get his way. He leaves in a huff, and I'm so relieved to get away from this entitled prick. The guy was Elliot Roger. I grew up in a small town in North Wales, United Kingdom. The local cinema had been closed for 15 years, but a guy from out of town had reopened it. As kids, this blew our minds as it was a rural area with very little to offer in terms of entertainment, so it seemed unbelievable to us that we would actually have a cinema in town. On one visit to the cinema, I ended up needing to use the toilet during a film, so left the theater, walked through the foyer and into the toilet. There was no toilet paper, so I went back into the foyer and spoke to the cinema owner to ask if he had any toilet paper. I was younger than 10 at the time and very nervous about speaking to adults, but the owner was incredibly kind and friendly, gave me the toilet paper, and we had a conversation about the film and how happy I was that we now had a cinema in the town. I used the toilet, then went back into the theater. A few weeks later, the friendly cinema man was on the front page of every newspaper. He was Peter Moore. My uncle's manager at the fast food place where he worked in high school invited him and another kid over to his place after work. My uncle and his friend declined, and they were very glad they did years later when it became public what exactly his former manager, John Wayne Gacy, was doing to and with those kids he invited over. A few years ago, my mother took my son, who was about 6 at the time, to get Santa photos done. A few months later, Toronto police arrested him. He had murdered several men. He ran a landscaping company and was hiding the bodies in the ground and planting pots of jobs he was doing, and also working as a mall Santa. The thing that's messed up to me is, I'm aware of his actions, but somewhere a family has a photo of their child on his lap, completely unaware, a full-fledged serial killer on display. Back in the 1980s, my parents and I lived out in Kansas. My father would work as an electrician for new homes during the spring to fall months, and he would pick up random jobs over the winter. One year he was working at ADT out of Wichita, and one morning it was too cold and he could not get his truck to start, so his coworker drove by and picked him up. After their shift, he dropped my father off, and my father invited him in to meet his family. My father introduced him to us. He said, "You can call me Uncle Dennis." This confused me as a kid. I was 7 or 8 at the time, as I had just met this guy, and I had an uncle named Dennis that lived down the road from me, and this guy sure as heck is not him. He then proceeded to grab me and pick me up. I was a fat kid, my parents never picked me up, and it was kind of freaky to be picked up like that. He then went on to talk to my mom and dad for a bit, and I went off to play with toys or watch TV. Flash forward a bit, it's now 2005, and I am now in a completely different state, still living with my father who was in need of care. My mother passed away years before. The news comes on, and a familiar face is on the screen. I raced downstairs as fast as possible and turned the TV to that channel for my father. I watched my father turn pale. The news announced they arrested Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. This was my father's co-worker at ADT. My father was silent for a moment before he responded, something along the lines of, "That mother sucker." I thought it was odd. When he made that comment to my mother, "You better watch out with being home alone out this far in the country. You're about the same age as the BTK victims." While I was at university, I worked at a cafe in a local shopping center. One of our regular customers was a mother and son who would come have breakfast most mornings. The mother was delightful, however the son always seemed a bit off. Nothing major, just you would say, "Have a great day," and he would reply with, "Yes." Anyway, one day he comes in without his mother and has breakfast. The next day his face is all over the news as he had just been arrested for murdering his mother. I had an employee that worked for me doing minor maintenance repairs on construction equipment. One day it just took him way too long on a job and I was upset. I pulled the global positioning system, GPS information, and he was nowhere near where he was supposed to be. My admin and I both called him repeatedly with no response. Now I'm even more frustrated because this wasn't the first time he took too long, didn't answer. His company provided Nextel radio. We start digging, find out this has happened repeatedly. He gets back late and I waited for him, alone in my office. I terminated him and he took it surprisingly well. Surprised me because I dealt with a ton of BS as a woman, working in a male-dominated field and company. A few years later, I'm working in a different location for the same company and some cops show up and want to know what I remember about him. I tell them I fired him, etc. They subpoena the GPS records from the company. Then they start finding the rest of the bodies. He pled down and pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was picking up prostitutes in the company work truck, killing them and dumping bodies in a rural part of the neighboring county. He killed more than half of a whole family. Paid him to remove a problematic tree that I wasn't confident about cutting down without dropping it on my home. He convinced me to save the tree and just remove a few limbs that were dangers. He just seemed like a dude. A month later, he murdered everyone in the house except a young girl whom he abducted. He stuffed the bodies of the mother, mother's friend, son into the hollow of a tree. When his home was later searched, it was full of piles of leaves and wallpapered to look like trees, and the abducted girl was locked in the basement, Ohio. I coached his kids' soccer team for a few years. His kids were fun-loving goofballs that had 2 left feet. He worried that people would pick on them. He once stuck around to offer support when we had a parent acting up because the dude was huge. My kids were in his wife's class in elementary school. She was a nice lady. She left town and no one heard anything from her after he was arrested for strangling prostitutes. My grandparents took me on a road trip and stopped in Shreveport to gamble. I sat on a bench and read for hours. Sounds crappy, but my attention span wasn't completely fried at that point and I was happy to read as long as anyone would let me. Another kid a couple of years younger was in the same situation, but he was not a reader. We start talking and he eventually starts telling me about the neighborhood animals he's tortured and killed, cats, dogs, wild animals. He was an equal opportunity monster. Might have been just trying to impress a stranger, might currently have a crawl space packed with bodies. Who knows? When I was about 7, my sister and I became convinced our neighbor was a serial killer because he was coming and going all hours of the night and constantly had his bathroom light on. My bathroom window had a view of the side of his house, so we wrote all of our evidence on my window with Expo markers. A few weeks after our investigation began, my dad was out front mowing the lawn early in the morning when the neighbor came out and asked him for a cigarette. My dad said he didn't have one, so the neighbor kept walking. A little while later, we heard sirens. There was a man who always walked his little wiener dog around the neighborhood, kind of a local celebrity. He was walking around the apartment complex 2 houses down from us when the neighbor saw him and stabbed him to death. The guy never gave a motive aside from mental illness, but my dad's theory is that the neighbor really wanted a cigarette and we all knew wiener dog guy smoked. So if wiener dog guy said no, that might have caused him to snap. I met the murderer of Grace Mullane on the day he was figuring out how to hide the body. So the night after he killed her, he came into the block of shops I was working at and was looking for a suitcase. He stopped by my store and asked but didn't buy them. So he went to the warehouse next to me. That week I got stopped numerous times going home as the police were looking for a shovel. Coming to find out the shovel was across our store at the car wash as he left it there. I even talked to the employee and was wondering why there was a muddy shovel left in one of his slots. You can see on videos him taking the suitcase in the elevator, which was brought in the store next to mine. The fact that he looked normal, acted normal, and bought all these things still spooks me. You would never know. Poor girl. I was at a shopping mall in Los Angeles when a man approached me saying he was a casting agent / photographer. I immediately knew something was off with the guy because that is the #1 scam in the book, but he just gave off such vibes that I instinctively knew he was very dangerous. I politely took his card and made a mad dash to the H&M and hid in the dressing stalls. I alerted a staff member and they had security walk me to the car. The gift of fear is real and trusted. About 2 months later, I had the news on in the background and I saw his face. He had been arrested for abducting and murdering a girl from Michigan. He approached her the same way he did me. Scariest thing ever. I believe there was a new Dateline podcast series out about it. I used to work in true crime television, and I can't even listen to the podcast because it freaks me out how close I was to this guy. As I said above, we have the gift of fear. For a long time, women were taught to be polite and ignore this even if uncomfortable. It's super important to trust your gut, and as MFM says, F politeness. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, reactions, and of course your own wild stories in the comments. And here's another video YouTube thinks you'll love.